The polished marble floors of the Vanderbilt Grand Hotel reflected a world of shimmering light and whispered wealth. In the grand ballroom, crystal chandeliers hung like frozen waterfalls, casting a soft, expensive glow over everything they touched. The air smelled of delicate perfume, slow-roasted beef, and the faint, clean scent of money. Elena moved through this scene like a ghost in a black dress and white apron. She was part of the machinery of the evening, an essential but unseen component. Her tray, a wide, polished circle of silver, was an extension of her arm. On it, 12 flutes of champagne stood in a perfect trembling circle, each bubble rising in a golden stream to the surface. Her feet, clad in sensible, silent shoes, knew the exact path to weave between the tuxedos and gowns without a brush or a stumble. Tonight was the annual Horizon's Edge charity gala. The room was a living portrait of power. Near the entrance, a group of tech investors laughed with the sharp, barking sounds of people who'd won big. Their watches were slabs of dark metal on their wrists, telling a different kind of time than the one Elena lived by. By the far wall, old money stood in quieter clusters, their elegance worn as easily as their family names. Silk, velvet, and pearls spoke in hushed tones. Then there were the celebrities, the philanthropists, the people whose faces were familiar from screens and society pages. They were all here to see and be seen, to auction off exotic vacations for a good cause, and to remind each other of their place in this glittering constellation. For Elena, the cause was more immediate, a gravity that pulled at her every moment. The double shift tonight hostess for the early dinner, waitress for the main gala meant an extra $300 before tips. That was $300 closer to the mountain of her mother's medical bills, a number that lived on a folded piece of paper in her apron pocket, a number that sometimes felt heavier than the tray she carried. She delivered the champagne with a soft, "Here you are, sir," or a slight nod and a smile that didn't reach her eyes. The guests took the glasses without looking at her, their conversations continuing uninterrupted. She was scenery. She was part of the service. It was a fact, not a complaint. Her mind was a practical list. Table 6 needs more wine. The couple at 3 wants still water. No lemon. The man at the corner table has been signaling for a check for 5 minutes, providing the soundtrack. To all this wealth was a jazz trio set up on a low, velvet-draped stage. They were good, professionals. The bassist kept a cool, walking line. The drummer brushed the cymbals with a sound like falling rain. But the star was the pianist, a man in 50s with silver streaks in his hair, and hands that moved over the keys like they were having a private, joyful conversation. He played smooth, sophisticated standards Gershwin, Cole Porter music that was designed to be impressive, but not intrusive. A beautiful audio decoration. Elena allowed herself a tiny pause near the service door, her empty tray held at her side, to listen for just 8 seconds. A complicated run of notes danced from the piano, a cascade that resolved into the melody of night and day. Her father's voice, warm and gravelly, sounded in her memory. "Listen to the left hand, Mia. That's the heart. The right hand is just the fancy talking." She felt a familiar, dull ache. He had been a music teacher, a man whose world was made of scales and soul, not spreadsheets. The piano in their tiny living room had been his altar. He'd taught her that music wasn't just notes on a page. It was a language for everything words couldn't say, for joy that was too big, for sadness that was too deep. When he died, the music in the house had died with him. The piano was sold to help with the first wave of debts. Her mother's job at the library didn't cover the rent, let alone the strange, dizzy spells that had started 2 years ago, or the confusing diagnosis that followed. Elena's scholarship to the community college for music was deferred, then quietly forgotten. The waitressing job, which she'd taken as a temporary thing, became the foundation of her life. Her hands, which once practiced journey exercises for hours, now balanced heavy trays and polished countless wine glasses. The calluses on her fingertips were from work, not from guitar strings or piano keys. A sharp gesture from the head waiter snapped her back. She fetched a tray of Connep's miniature beef Wellingtons that cost more per bite than her hourly wage. As she circulated, she noticed the pianist, the man with the silver-streaked hair, shift uncomfortably on his bench. His playing didn't falter, but between songs, he wiped his brow with a handkerchief. His smile to his bandmates looked strained. The gala proceeded. A famous actress took the microphone to auction a weekend in Tuscany. Glasses were refilled. Laughter grew louder. Elena was clearing a table of dessert plates when she heard the first wrong note. It was a subtle clash, a chord that landed wrong. She looked up. The pianist had both hands pressed flat on the keys for a second, his head bowed. He stood up suddenly, mumbled something to the bassist, and walked off the stage with a hurried, stiff-legged gait, disappearing through a side door. The bassist and drummer exchanged a confused look. The drummer gave a soft, steady roll on the snare, a holding pattern. A minute passed. The elegant murmur of the crowd began to change its tone. It became a question. The missing music was a hole in the room, and the noise of conversation rushed in to fill it, sounding suddenly harsh and exposed without the piano's glue. A woman in a severe black suit, the event coordinator, appeared at the edge of the stage. Her face, usually a mask of calm control, was tight with panic. She spoke quickly to the bassist, her eyes darting toward the door the pianist had vanished through. She pressed a finger to her earpiece, her words sharp and low. "Well, find him. We can't have just drums and bass for the live auction." Elena stood by the service station, stacking dirty plates onto a cart. She watched the coordinator's composure crack. She saw the guests begin to glance at their watches, a few impatient sighs audible over the awkward thump of the bass line trying to solo. The beautiful machine of the evening had a broken cog, and the whole thing was starting to grind out. Her eyes drifted to the grand piano. It was a beautiful instrument, a Steinway, its lid propped open like a black wing. The stage lights gleamed off its polished surface. In the silence from its keys, it seemed almost lonely. A strange feeling stirred in Elena's chest, a mix of fear and a powerful magnetic pull. Her fingers, resting on the cold stainless steel of the plate cart, tingled with a memory of a different texture, the smooth ivory of keys. The gentle give of weighted hammer action. She thought of her father's hands, guiding hers. She thought of the silent piano at home, now gone. She thought of the folded bill in her apron, and her mother asleep in their quiet apartment. Exhausted from another long day of feeling unwell, the coordinator was now pacing, her heels clicking a frantic rhythm on the marble. The auctioneer looked uncertain, holding his gavel. The moment stretched, becoming uncomfortable. Elena took a deep, quiet breath. It felt like the first real breath she'd taken all night. Without allowing herself another second to think, she untied her apron. She folded it neatly, placing it on top of the dirty plates. She smoothed down her simple black waitress dress, wiped her palms on her thighs, and began to walk. Not towards the kitchen, but across the open floor, through the sea of silk and tuxedos, toward the stage where the coordinator stood in a small circle of distress. Her sensible shoes made no sound on the marble. Her heart was a wild drum in her chest, louder than anything in the room. She was walking away from her place in the background, and she had no idea what was on the other side. The walk from the service station to the edge of the stage felt longer than any distance she had ever crossed. The air, which had been a comfortable background of chatter and clinking glasses, now felt thick and heavy. Every step was a conscious effort, as if she were pushing through deep water. She could feel the eyes starting to land on her, little glances of confusion. A waitress, out of formation, moving with a strange purpose toward the front of the room. It was a break in the natural order of things, and it made people pause. Her focus was a narrow tunnel leading straight to the woman in the black suit. The event coordinator's back was to her, her shoulders rigid with tension as she whispered fiercely into her headset. The drummer, trying to be helpful, had shifted to a light, funky beat, but it only highlighted the absence of the melody. It sounded hollow, like a skeleton without its flesh. Elena stopped a few feet away, waiting. The coordinator, sensing a presence, turned sharply. Her eyes, wide with a kind of controlled panic, scanned Elena up and down, taking in the plain black dress, the sensible shoes, the absence of an apron. For a second, there was no recognition. She was just another staff member, now out of place. "What is it?" The coordinator snapped, her voice a low, tight wire. "I'm in the middle of a crisis. The auction is in 15 minutes. Elena's mouth was dry. The words she had practiced in her head on the walk over seemed to vanish. All she could hear was the thumping of her own heart. She swallowed, forcing her voice to work. It came out quieter than she intended, almost lost under the drumbeat. "The piano," she said. I can play. Just to fill the time. Until he gets back." The coordinator stared at her. It was a look of pure, uncomprehending astonishment. She blinked, as if trying to process a sentence in a foreign language. Her gaze flickered from Elena's face to her hands, then back again. "You, what?" The coordinator's voice lost its sharp edge, replaced by a flat disbelief. "You play. The piano." It wasn't a question. It was a statement of absurdity. Elena just nodded, her hands clasped tightly in front of her to stop them from trembling. A man in a tuxedo, one of the gala's organizers, sidled up to the coordinator. "Claire, we need music. Now. It's getting awkward. Can't they just play louder?" He gestured vaguely at the bassist and drummer. The coordinator, Claire, threw her hands up slightly. "We have a situation," she hissed, then looked back at Elena. The disbelief was being rapidly replaced by a desperate calculus. She was out of options. The principal pianist was clearly not coming back any time soon. The silent auction tables were at the back, but the live auction, the big-ticket event, required atmosphere, sophistication. You couldn't auction a private island to a funk drumbeat. She stepped closer to Elena, her eyes searching her face. "What do you play? What kind of music?" Her tone was interrogating, trying to find a flaw, a reason to say no. "Classical," Elena whispered. "Some jazz, standards. I can just play something soft. Background music." She was parroting the coordinator's own imagined need, trying to sound as small and uncontroversial as possible. Claire looked past Elena, scanning the ballroom. The pleasant social hum was turning into a louder, more fractured noise. People were starting to wonder what the holdup was. She was losing the room. Every second of silence from the stage was a mark against her, against the prestige of the event. She made a decision. It was written all over her face, a surrender to the least bad option. "Fine," she said, the word bitten off. "Fine, you have 10 minutes. 15, tops. Just keep it simple, quiet, nothing flashy. No vocals, just pleasant piano music. Do you understand? You are background. You are filler." Elena nodded again, too quickly. "Yes, of course, background." "The minute he returns," Claire said, pointing a stern finger toward the side door, "you get up and you leave, smoothly. You go right back to your station. No fuss. Yes, ma'am." Claire gave her one last, long look, a mixture of suspicion and profound hope. Then she turned and put a hand on the bassist's shoulder, leaning in to explain. The bassist's eyebrows shot up. He looked at Elena, then back at Claire, and shrugged, nodding. This was it. The point of no return. Elena turned to face the room. The grand piano sat on the low stage like a sleeping beast. The walk from the edge of the parquet floor up the 2 shallow steps felt like climbing a mountain. Her legs were weak. A fresh, cold wave of terror washed over her. What was she doing? These people weren't here to listen to some waitress mess around on a piano. They expected perfection. They paid for it. They were used to it in every aspect of their lives. She could feel hundreds of eyes on her now. The confusion in the room had crystallized into focused attention. Who was this woman? Why was a server walking onto the stage? A low, curious murmur spread through the crowd, replacing the impatient noise. It was the sound of an audience being presented with an unexpected puzzle dot as she reached the piano bench. A new, practical fear gripped her. The lights. From the stage, the ballroom was a sea of dim, expectant faces, with the bright, hot spotlights creating a wall of glare around her. She was exposed, completely visible. She pulled the bench out, the legs scraping softly on the wooden stage floor. The sound, tiny in the huge room, seemed to echo. She sat down. The leather of the bench was cool. She adjusted it slightly, a small, familiar ritual. This was the moment. Her hands hovered over the keys, pale against the black and white. They looked like a waitress's hands, clean, capable, unadorned, except for a tiny, faded silver ring on her right pinky, her father's old ring. For a horrible second, her mind went blank. Completely, utterly empty. She couldn't remember a single note. Not one chord. She stared at the keys, and they were just a pattern, a geometry of ivory and ebony that meant nothing. The silence in the room was a physical pressure. She could hear the rustle of a dress, the clearing of a throat from the front row. Then, she did what her father had taught her to do when she was nervous before a recital. Back when she was a girl with braids and a too big dress. She closed her eyes. She shut out the lights, the faces, the gowns, the tuxedos, the weight of the entire evening dot. She breathed in, deep and slow. She thought not of music, but of a feeling. She thought of the quiet, dusty light in her parents' living room on a Sunday afternoon. She thought of the sound of her father humming along, slightly off-key, as he graded papers on the couch. She thought of the safe, solid feeling of the old, upright piano, the one they'd sold, with its chipped middle C and its worm. Slightly muffled sound. Her fingers found their starting position by muscle memory, by a map written into her bones from 1,000 hours of practice. They settled on the keys, not pressing down, just resting. They knew where to go. She opened her eyes. The world had narrowed to the piano in front of her. The crowd, the coordinator, her own fear, it all faded into a distant blur. There was only the instrument. She began to play. The first notes were soft, tentative. A simple, clear melody. It wasn't jazz. It wasn't a standard. It was the opening of Eric Satie's Gymnopédie No. 1. She had chosen it because it was beautiful, slow, and almost painfully simple in its construction. It was the definition of quiet background music. The notes fell into the silent room like single drops of water into a still pond. She played it straight, just as written, for a few bars. Her touch was gentle, letting the sustained pedal carry the harmonies. She kept her head down, her focus on her hands. She was the filler. She was the background. Just like she'd promised. But as the familiar melancholic melody unfolded, something in her began to unlock. The stiffness in her shoulders, held tight all night from carrying trays and tension, began to ease. Her back straightened, not into a rigid posture, but into the natural, curved line of someone at home, at a keyboard. Her breathing settled into the rhythm of the phrases. She reached the end of the first section, and instead of moving directly to the next, she let her left hand linger, holding a bass note. Her right hand, almost of its own volition, began to wander. It drifted away from Sadie's notes and started to weave a different thread, a slow, blues-inflected line that echoed the hymn-like feeling of the piece, but added a deeper, more personal sorrow. It was a variation her father had taught her, a game they used to play. What if Sadie had the blues? The change was subtle at first. Just a bent note here, a different chord resolution there. But the character of the music shifted. It was no longer just a pretty French melody. It became a story. The quiet in the room deepened, became more attentive. The last of the conversational murmurs died away. Elena, lost in the confluence of memory and music, didn't notice. She was no longer playing for the room, or for the coordinator, or to fill time. She was playing for the dusty living room, for the man on the couch, for the girl with the braids. Her right hand grew more confident, tracing lyrical, aching shapes over the steady, marching left-hand chords. She blended the classical form with a raw, soulful emotion that didn't belong in a grand hotel ballroom. It belonged in a church or on a front porch at dusk. She was no longer a waitress covering a gap. She was a musician, speaking in the only language that had ever made complete sense to her. And for the first time in years, the language was hers alone to speak. The last of the Sadie melody dissolved into the air, leaving only the echo of a single sustained bass note. In that sliver of silence, a shift occurred. It was not in the room, but within her. The stiffness that had held her together, the straight-backed posture of service, the careful mask of the efficient worker melted away from her shoulders. They dropped, not in a slump, but in a release. Her spine found a natural, confident curve, the curve of someone who has spent a lifetime leaning toward music. The timid waitress receded like a shadow at dawn, out her hands, which had moved with cautious grace, now settled into a deeper connection with the keyboard. Her touch changed. It was no longer about pressing the right keys to make a pleasant sound. It became a conversation. Her fingers listened to the instrument, feeling the weight and resistance of the Steinway's action, a beautiful, responsive machine so different from the old upright of her childhood. Yet somehow familiar in its soul, she began to improvise in earnest. The simple, hymn-like chords of her variation began to walk. Her left hand established a slow, deep, rolling rhythm, a heartbeat that was both solemn and swinging. It was the rhythm of a late-night train, of rain on a rooftop, of a quiet thought turning over and over. Over this foundation, her right hand began to speak. It started with a searching melody, a few clear notes that asked a wordless question. Then it answered itself with a cascade of sound, flowing down the keys like water over smooth stones. The music was no longer recognizable as any one thing. It was not classical, not jazz, not gospel. It was a blend of all of them, filtered through the story of her own life. A snippet of a Chopin etude she'd struggled with as a teenager wove itself into a blues scale. A phrase from an old spiritual her father loved emerged, then transformed into something more complex, more personal. She forgot where she was. The hot stage lights became a warm sun. The scent of perfumes and food faded, replaced in her mind by the smell of old books in her father's study and lemon polish on wood. The sea of watching faces vanished. She was alone with the sound. Her expression, which had been fixed in concentration, softened. A slight, unconscious frown of effort appeared between her brows as she reached for a difficult passage, then smoothed away as her hands found the solution. A faint, real smile touched her lips as a playful, syncopated phrase danced out, a musical memory of her father making her laugh during a tedious practice session. Her eyes were open, but they saw nothing in the present room. They were looking at the past, at feeling, at the architecture of the song she was building, note by note, The effect on the ballroom was absolute. The last clink of a fork on a plate had died away minutes ago. No one coughed. No one whispered. The servers, frozen in place near the kitchen doors, held their trays like statues. The event coordinator, Claire, stood with one hand still pressed to her earpiece, her mouth slightly open, her earlier panic replaced by stunned incomprehension. The guests were transfixed. This was not what any of them had expected. They had expected, at best, competent filler. A pleasant distraction. What they were getting was a performance. A raw, intimate, and technically breathtaking confession in music. An elderly gentleman in the front row, a titan of industry known for his impatience, had stopped checking his watch. His gnarled hands rested on the table still. He was watching her hands, watching the blur of motion that was both powerful and delicate. He had heard the world's greatest orchestras from the best boxes, but this was different. This was direct. This was human. A well-known film producer at a central table leaned forward, her chin resting on her steepled fingers. Her critical eye, used to dissecting performances, saw no technique to pick apart, only pure expression. She wasn't listening to a waitress play piano. She was listening to a person tell a story of loss, memory, and quiet resilience. It was more compelling than any script she'd read that year. Near the back, a young woman, the daughter of one of the philanthropists, who had spent the evening bored and scrolling subtly on her phone under the table, had let the device drop into her lap. Her eyes were bright, glued to the stage. She saw someone not much older than herself, in a simple black dress, commanding the attention of a room full of powerful people without saying a single word. It felt like a quiet revolution. The music swelled. Alina's left hand built a series of chords that climbed, each one richer and more urgent than the last. It was a sound of struggle, of pushing against a weight. Her right hand answered with a soaring, lyrical line that fought its way upward through the harmony, insistent and beautiful. It was the sound of hope refusing to be extinguished. The dynamic grew, not through pounding force, but through intensity of feeling. The grand piano filled the vast space, not with noise, but with a profound and moving energy. Then, as quickly as it had built, the tension broke. The music descended into a gentle, reflective passage. The rolling rhythm softened to a whisper. The melody became a series of echoes, fragments of the theme she had already introduced, now settling like dust in a sunbeam. It was a remembering. A sigh. Her playing became softer, more introspective. The final minute was a masterclass in delicate control. Single notes hung in the air, spaced apart by breaths of silence. A simple, perfect chord here. A fleeting, glittering run there, like a memory too bright to look at directly. She was bringing the story to a close, not with a bang, but with a gradual, peaceful letting go. The last phrase was a return to the very beginning, a ghost of the Sati melody, just 3 notes falling. Her left hand played one final deep, resonant bass note and held the pedal. The note hummed in the belly of the great piano, a vibration you could feel in your chest. She lifted her right hand from the keys and let it rest in her lap. Her left hand slowly released the key, but the pedal kept the sound alive. It hung in the utterly silent ballroom, a warm, fading ghost of sound. And then it was gone. Complete silence. It was a thick, deep silence, weighted with the absence of the music that had just filled every corner of the room. It was not an awkward silence anymore. It was the silence of an audience holding its breath, suspended in the feeling she had created. Elena's awareness crashed back into her body. The warmth of the lights became heat again. The blur of faces snapped into sharp focus. She saw hundreds of people perfectly still, all looking at her. A cold wave of reality washed over her, shocking her system. What had she done? She had played for herself. She had broken every rule. She had not been background music. She had taken the stage and poured her heart out in front of the city's elite. Her earlier fear returned, magnified 100 times. Her hands, which had felt so sure moments ago, began to tremble in her lap. She felt exposed, naked. She had just shown them a part of her soul she kept hidden even from her coworkers, even from her mother on her hardest days. She wanted to disappear into the floor. She moved to stand up, her legs feeling like water, intending to flee the stage as quickly and quietly as she had come. Then, the sound began. It started with a single pair of hands in the front row, the elderly industrialist, clapping with a slow, solid, deliberate rhythm. It was joined instantly by another, then another. In 2 seconds, the silence shattered into a wave of applause. It wasn't the polite, obligatory clapping that follows a scheduled performance. It was explosive, vigorous, and filled with genuine awe. People rose to their feet. The film producer was on her feet, applauding firmly. The bored young woman was clapping so hard her hands stung. The servers by the door were grinning, one of them letting out a low, appreciative whistle that was lost in the roar. The sound hit Elena like a physical force. She froze, halfway off the bench, her eyes wide. The applause swelled, filling the space where her music had been. A tidal wave of approval she had never imagined, never sought. She looked out, bewildered, searching the standing crowd for understanding, and found only faces alight with appreciation. For a moment, she was paralyzed, caught between the instinct to run and the overwhelming shock of the response. She had stepped up to fill a gap, but what she had done was something else entirely. She had stopped being the help, and for a few minutes had become the only thing in the room that mattered. And now, the room was telling her so in the loudest, most unmistakable way possible. The applause roared around her, a physical wave of sound that seemed to vibrate the stage floor. Elena stood frozen, one hand on the piano for balance, caught in the act of trying to flee. The sheer force of the noise, the sight of the entire ballroom on its feet, was overwhelming. It was too big, too bright. Her mind, which had been a river of music moments before, was now a dry, cracked bed of pure panic. She had a single clear thought. I need to get off this stage. She managed a small, stiff bow, more of a duck of her head, and turned toward the steps. But the path was blocked. The original pianist, the man with the silver-streaked hair, was standing there at the edge of the stage. He had returned, looking pale but composed. He wasn't just clapping. He was smiling, a wide, genuine smile of admiration that crinkled the corners of his eyes. He stepped forward, his hand extended not to shake hers, but to gently guide her back toward the center of the stage. He leaned in close so she could hear him over the din. No, my dear. You take this. You earned it. He then took the microphone from its stand. The feedback squealed briefly, cutting through the applause and finally quieting the crowd. People settled back into their seats, but the energy in the room remained, buzzing and alert. Ladies and gentlemen, the pianist said, his voice warm and filled with the musician's easy authority. I have to say, I returned feeling a bit obsolete. A light, appreciative chuckle rippled through the audience. I believe I am being upstaged in the best possible way. He turned fully to Elena, who was standing rigidly beside him, wishing she could sink into the floor. What you just gave us? That was not playing. That was speaking. That was breathtaking, truly. He handed her the microphone. It felt alien and heavy in her hand. The crowd's attention narrowed to a laser point on her. She stared at it, then out at the sea of expectant faces. Her throat closed. She couldn't form a word. Seeing her distress, the pianist smoothly took the microphone back with a kind nod. I think we're all a little speechless, he said to the crowd, earning another gentle laugh. Let's just say, Sometimes the most extraordinary gifts come from the most unexpected places. Please, another round of applause for... I'm sorry, I don't believe I caught your name. This was it. The moment of exposure. Her voice was a dry whisper, but the microphone caught it, amplifying it into a soft, clear sound across the hall. Elena. For Elena, the pianist announced, and the applause surged again, softer now, but lasting as the clapping finally died down to a murmur. The event coordinator, Claire, was not clapping. She was thinking. The panic on her face had been completely replaced by a sharp, calculating focus. This was no longer a crisis. It was an opportunity. The awkward gap in the program had turned into the talking point of the night. She watched as the host of the gala, a silver-haired philanthropist known for his sharp mind and genuine love of the arts, stood up from his place at the head table. He moved with a calm purpose through the crowd, nodding at guests, his eyes fixed on the stage. He ascended the steps and first shook the original pianist's hand, saying something quietly that made the man nod and pat his shoulder. Then he turned to Elena. Up close, he was older than he looked from a distance, but his eyes were a bright, intelligent blue. He didn't offer his hand immediately. He could see she was trembling. Elena, he said, his voice low and meant only for her. That was a remarkable thing. I've sat through a lot of galas. I've never heard a room that quiet. His smile was kind, not demanding. Would you join me at my table for a moment? I'd like to thank you properly, and I promise to rescue you from this spotlight. It wasn't a request from a guest to a waitress. It was an invitation from one person to another. Numbly, she nodded. He offered his arm, a genteel, old-fashioned gesture that gave her something steady to hold on to. As she took it, she felt the fine weave of his tuxedo jacket under her fingers. He led her off the stage and through the tables. The guests they passed smiled at her, some giving small nods. Their looks were different now. They were seeing her. They arrived at the head table. It was a different world up close. The centerpiece was a modest sculpture of glass, not flowers. The chairs were larger, more comfortable. A server, one of her coworkers, a young man named Ben, was instantly there, his eyes wide with amazement. He pulled out a chair for her without being asked. Some water for our guest, please, the host said to Ben, who scurried off. The host then turned to the others at the table. Everyone, this is Elena. I think you'll agree she's provided us with the highlight of the evening. The people at the table, a sleek woman in architect's glasses, a man with a carefully trimmed beard, a couple who looked like they'd stepped off a yacht, all offered warm, curious smiles. They didn't fire questions at her. They simply included her in their circle. The water arrived. Elena took a sip, the cold liquid shocking her back into her body a little. The host waited until she set the glass down. I have to ask, he said, leaning in slightly. That piece at the end, the improvisation, that came from somewhere very real. Who taught you to play like that? The question was simple, but it unlocked the door. Haltingly at first, then in a steadying stream, she told him. Not her whole life story, but the heart of it. Her father, the music teacher. The piano in the living room. The sold instrument. The deferred dreams. She kept it brief, her eyes mostly on her hands in her lap. She mentioned her mother and the need to work, just enough to paint the picture without asking for pity. She was just explaining why a person who could play like that was clearing dessert plates. The table listened, utterly engaged. The man with the beard rested his chin on his hand. The woman in glasses shook her head slowly, not in disbelief, but in appreciation of the story. As she finished, a new presence approached the table. It was a man in a perfectly tailored but unconventional suit, no tie. He had a quiet intensity about him. He waited politely for Elena to finish speaking. "Forgive the interruption," he said, his voice a calm, measured baritone. He looked directly at Elena. "My name is David Chun. I produce music." He said it not as a boast, but as a simple fact, like stating his profession was dentist or lawyer. He handed a simple, thick card to the host, who glanced at it and gave a slight nod of recognition, then handed it to Elena. "What you did wasn't just technique. It was narrative. It was emotion translated directly into sound. I have a studio downtown. I would be very interested in having you come in, whenever you're able, just to play. No pressure, no contracts. Just to see what happens when you have space and time to create. The card has my direct line." Elena took the card. It was heavy, textured paper. She just stared at the embossed letters, unable to process what was being offered. The host, seeing her overwhelmed, spoke again. "David is a hard man to impress," he said to Elena. "That's a genuine offer." He then turned his bright eyes back to her. "Your story about your mother? And the burdens you're carrying for your family? That is the real music, isn't it? The life behind it." He paused, thinking. "There is a foundation I work with. They don't just fund artists. They fund people who are artists, especially when life has gotten in the way. I would like to introduce you to them. They can help with things like making sure you have the freedom to consider offers like David's." The world was tilting on its axis. Minutes ago, her biggest concern was whether Table 7 would tip on their exorbitant wine bill. Now, a famous producer was giving her a card, and one of the city's most powerful men was talking about foundations and freedom. It was too much. Her eyes filled with hot, sudden tears. She blinked them back furiously, looking down at the tablecloth. "I don't know what to say," she whispered, her voice thick. The host placed a gentle, paternal hand over hers on the table for just a second. "You don't have to say anything. You already said it all." Just then, Ben the server appeared again, hovering nervously. He leaned down to Elena. "Claire needs to see you for a second." "By the kitchen." It's okay." Excusing herself, Elena stood, her legs still unsteady. She walked back through the ballroom, the music from the reinstated trio now playing with renewed energy washing over her. The guests she passed now looked at her with clear recognition and smiles. Claire was waiting by the service doors, her clipboard held tightly, but her expression was completely transformed. The severe, stressed mask was gone. She looked at Elena with something like awe and a new, profound respect. "Elena," she said, her voice firm but not unkind. "First, obviously, thank you. You saved the evening. More than saved it." She took a breath. "Second, your shifts for the rest of the night are covered. You are a guest of the hotel now, but—" She hesitated, a businesslike gleam entering her eye. "The manager and I have been talking. We would like to offer you a new position. Our resident pianist for the Crystal Lounge and for events like this is retiring next month. We think you might be perfect for it. It would be a contract, benefits, and it would mean playing, not serving." She handed Elena a single sheet of hotel letterhead, a formal offer of employment for the position of resident pianist, with a salary figure that made Elena's breath catch in her chest. It was more than double what she made now, with set hours. "You don't have to answer now," Claire said quickly. "Talk to your new friends. Think about it. But the offer is real." Elena took the paper, the producer's card. The walk home that night was different. The city sounds, the distant wail of a siren, the rumble of a late-night bus, the chatter from a diner were the same, but they felt new. Elena carried them differently. The weight in her apron pocket was gone, replaced by a light, fluttering feeling in her chest. In her bag, instead of a wad of crumpled cash tips, she carried 2 pieces of paper, the thick card from the producer and the formal hotel letterhead with the job offer. They were real, solid things, but they felt like fragments of a dream she was afraid would vanish if she blinked. She pushed open the door to the apartment. The familiar scent lemony cleaner, old books, the faint, ever-present smell of her mother's medication wrapped around her. It was the smell of worry, of survival. But tonight, it was just home. Her mother was dozing in the armchair, a book open in her lap, the television on mute. A small lamp cast a warm pool of light. She stirred as Elena came in, her eyes flickering open. "You're late, Mia," she said, her voice soft with sleep. "Long night? Bad tips?" Elena knelt by the chair, taking her mother's thin hand in her own. She looked at the tired face, the lines of constant, low-grade pain etched around her eyes. For years, their conversations had been a quiet litany of practicalities, the cost of prescriptions, the hours of her next shift, the price of groceries. "No, Mama," Elena said, her own voice sounding strange to her. "Not bad tips." And then she told her. The words tumbled out in a soft rush, the pianist getting sick, the terrifying walk to the coordinator, the feeling of the bench, the silence of the room. She described the music not as notes, but as a journey, back to their old living room, back to her father. She told her about the silence after, the roar that followed, the man at the table, the producer's card, the hotel's offer. She showed her the papers. Her mother listened, her tired eyes growing wider and clearer with each sentence. She didn't interrupt. When Elena finished, a single tear traced a path down her mother's cheek. She wasn't a woman given to big displays, but she squeezed Elena's hand with a strength that seemed to come from a deep, forgotten place. He would have loved to hear that," she whispered, her voice cracking. "His music, it didn't go away. It was just waiting." The next week was a blur, but a slow, deliberate blur. Elena didn't quit her job. She went to her shifts at the hotel, but everything had changed. The other servers looked at her with a mix of awe and friendly jealousy, calling her Maestro with grins. The managers nodded with new respect. Claire, the coordinator, now spoke to her as a colleague, discussing schedules and repertoire for the future. She met with the foundation representative, a kind, no-nonsense woman in a sunny office. It wasn't charity, the woman explained. It was an investment in cultural capital. They could help restructure her mother's medical debt into a manageable plan. They had a grant that could cover the tuition for the music program she'd deferred, if she still wanted it. They could even provide a small stipend for living expenses, so she could reduce her hours in practice. It was a hand up, not a handout, designed to remove the roadblocks, not to pave the road for her. She went to the producer's studio. It was a quiet, spacious room with a gorgeous vintage piano and soundproof walls that swallowed all the noise of the city. David Shunn didn't make her play anything specific. He just said, "Get comfortable. Play when you're ready." For the first hour, she just sat there, overwhelmed by the potential of the silent space. Then she began to play. Not the Satie, not the big improvisation from the gala, but new things. Fragments of melodies that had come to her on the bus, chord progressions that felt like questions. He sat in the corner, eyes closed, just listening. At the end, he simply said, "You have a voice. When you're ready to record it, I'm here." She accepted the hotel's offer, but on her terms. She would be the resident pianist for the Crystal Lounge 3 nights a week and for special events. The rest of her time was for her mother, for her studies, for the studio. The hotel agreed. They weren't just hiring a pianist. They were hiring the story, the girl who had captivated the gala. It was good for business that the first night of her new role arrived. She didn't wear the black waitress dress. She wore a simple, elegant dress of her own, dark blue. She didn't enter through the service entrance. She walked through the grand lobby, The Crystal Lounge was a more intimate space than the ballroom, all soft leather chairs and low lighting. A newer, smaller grand piano sat in the corner. The crowd was a mix: hotel guests, a few couples on dates, some people ending their business day with a drink. They weren't a captive black-tie audience. They were there to talk, to unwind. Elena felt a flicker of the old fear. This was a job now. There were expectations. What if she'd been a one-time miracle? What if the magic only worked under pressure? She sat at the piano. She looked at her hands, then out at the room. People were chatting, glancing at menus, not paying her any attention. It was the definition of background music. She took a deep breath and thought not of the gala, but of the studio, of the space to explore. She began to play something soft, modern, and meandering. It was nice, pleasant, it did its job, but as she played, she saw a young couple leaning close, speaking in hushed, intense tones. She saw an older man sitting alone, staring into his drink. She saw a woman typing furiously on a laptop, then stopping to rub her temples. These were not elites on display. These were just people, with their own quiet stories of stress and love and tiredness. Her music began to change. It subtly wrapped itself around the room's mood. For the couple, her left hand found a warm, romantic chord progression. For the lonely man, the melody became a series of thoughtful, questioning phrases. For the tired woman, the rhythm softened into something languid and peaceful. She wasn't performing for them. She was playing with them, weaving a gentle sonic tapestry that made the room feel softer, kinder. She wasn't the stunning centerpiece here. She was part of the atmosphere, but in the most alive way possible. A few people glanced over and smiled. The typing woman closed her laptop for a moment and just listened. This was different from the triumph of the gala. This was quieter, more sustainable. This was a conversation. Later, on her break, she checked her phone. There was a message from her mother, sent with great effort. A box came for you, from the basement storage. Your father's things. When her shift ended, she went home. There, on the kitchen table, was a cardboard box, dusty and old. Inside, carefully wrapped in yellowed newspaper, were her father's sheet music books, scribbled compositions on napkins and staff paper, and at the very bottom, his old metronome, the wood worn smooth from his touch. She wound the metronome and set it on the piano they had rented last week. A modest upright, but it was theirs. She placed the producer's card and the hotel contract on the lid. She opened one of his books to a Chopin nocturne, covered in his penciled notes. Asterisk, breathe here. Mia, feel this like a sigh. Asterisk, she set the metronome ticking, a soft, steady click, click, click. That was the sound of time, measured not in shifts or bills, but in beats. She placed her fingers on the keys, the same keys she would practice on, perform on, maybe one day record on. The future wasn't a sudden, glittering prize she had won. It was this. It was the quiet, daily choice to sit down and work. It was the weight of her father's notes in the margins. It was the sound of her mother sleeping peacefully in the next room. The crushing weight of fear finally lifted from both their shoulders. She began to play the nocturne, following his marks, her own hands telling the old story in a new way. The music filled the small apartment, not with the roar of an audience, but with something better, the sound of a life, once interrupted, finding its rhythm again. Note by note, breath by breath.